The neighborhood had always been quiet, the kind of place where lawns were perfectly manicured, mailboxes gleamed in the sun, and neighbors waved politely from across the street. For years, this tranquility had been taken for granted, until one woman moved into the cul-de-sac and quickly became the storm no one could ignore. Her name was Linda, though everyone in the neighborhood would come to know her simply as the HOA Karen. From the very beginning, Linda had made it clear she was there to enforce order, control, and perfection. It started with small things: a letter about the height of a neighbor's flower bed, a complaint about a slightly chipped mailbox, a warning about an inflatable Halloween decoration that dared to peek over a fence line. Each note was signed with a flourish and a stern warning that fines would follow if the rules were not strictly observed. At first, neighbors laughed it off, thinking perhaps she was just new and overly enthusiastic. But it didn't take long for her true nature to emerge. By the end of her first year in the neighborhood, Linda had escalated her control. She began attending HOA meetings not as a participant, but as a relentless prosecutor. Every minor violation became a spectacle, with neighbors feeling her eyes watching their every move. The community pool's hours were questioned, lawn ornament rules were reinterpreted in her favor, and even the timing of garbage cans being set out became an opportunity for criticism. Every action in the neighborhood seemed to be under her microscopic scrutiny. Her tactics were not subtle. She would photograph lawns that were not perfectly cut, record children playing outside past quiet hours, and meticulously log every perceived infraction in a binder she carried to meetings. When she filed her complaints, she did so with the precision of a lawyer preparing a case, complete with timestamps, dates, and citations from HOA bylaws. It was this meticulous attention to detail, combined with an unyielding sense of authority, that made her feared. The other residents tried to adapt. They trimmed hedges a little straighter, they timed their weekend activities to avoid disturbing her peace, and they even held back on putting up seasonal decorations. But Linda was never satisfied. No matter what they did, there was always something else to complain about, another rule to interpret in the strictest way, another opportunity to assert her dominance. The neighborhood was no longer a community. It had become a series of carefully monitored zones under her surveillance. As her power grew, so did her boldness. One of the first major turning points came when she targeted the Johnsons, an elderly couple who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. The Johnsons had a giant oak tree in their front yard, its branches sprawling wide and leaves creating a canopy of shade over their property. To Linda, the tree was a safety hazard, despite no complaints from anyone else. She filed repeated complaints with the HOA, demanded inspections, and even suggested the tree be trimmed or removed entirely. The Johnsons, shocked and exhausted, eventually complied with a partial trimming, but the damage to the sense of security in the neighborhood was done. Neighbors began to talk quietly among themselves, sharing stories of Linda's relentless enforcement. There was the young couple whose driveway cracked slightly, resulting in a formal warning. There was the retired teacher who planted a small vegetable garden in the side yard, only to receive a stern letter claiming it violated the HOA's landscape uniformity clause. Even pets were not safe from her scrutiny. Barking dogs were considered disturbances, and owners were threatened with fines. By now, Linda had cultivated an almost legendary reputation in the neighborhood, not as a friendly guide, but as a merciless enforcer whose presence cast a shadow over every lawn and mailbox. But it wasn't just her relentless enforcement that made her infamous. It was her public displays of authority. During HOA meetings, she would stand at the podium with an air of superiority, reading off lists of violations with a level of intensity that made people flinch. Some neighbors attempted to speak up, to question her motives or defend themselves, but Linda was prepared for every argument. She had memorized every clause in the HOA's rules and regulations, and she wielded them like weapons. What began as a community of friends had devolved into a courtroom where she presided as judge, jury, and executioner. Yet, despite all this, there were whispers of resistance. A few neighbors had begun quietly discussing ways to push back, to find loopholes in the rules, to regain some sense of normalcy. They were careful at first, hesitant to act too openly, knowing that any misstep could result in another complaint, another fine, another opportunity for Linda to flex her power. But the tension in the air was growing, a low hum that promised that a breaking point was approaching. As the months went by, her control only intensified. Even casual gatherings became high-stakes events. Neighborhood barbecues had to be scheduled around her approval, holiday lights were trimmed to her standards, and casual conversations on front lawns became exercises in caution. The HOA Karen had transformed from a mere neighbor into an omnipresent force, a symbol of order twisted into obsession. By the end of her second year in the neighborhood, it was clear that Linda had gone too far. The community, once cohesive and friendly, was fractured and anxious. The fear of her scrutiny loomed over every home, every lawn, every mailbox. And yet, somewhere in the shadows of this controlled chaos, a spark of defiance began to flicker. Neighbors who had once been silent were now quietly plotting, exchanging notes, and sharing stories of her overreach. It was the beginning of a movement, a subtle but growing desire to reclaim their neighborhood from the grip of the HOA Karen. Little did Linda know, the very obsession that had given her power would soon make her vulnerable. The meticulous documentation, the relentless enforcement, the obsession with perfection, all of it would be turned against her in ways she could never imagine. And when that time came, the neighborhood would discover that even the most feared HOA Karen was not invincible.